Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this Twitter X Space hosted by Texas Policy Research. My name is Jeremy Kitchen. I'm the president of Texas Policy Research. Our nonprofit organization is dedicated to providing dependable legislative analysis, data, and research to ensure that Texas remains a beacon of liberty and opportunity. Dr. Vance Ginn, a distinguished member of our board of directors, is joining me today. Dr. Ginn is an accomplished economist and public policy expert who has dedicated his career to advancing the principles of free markets and limited government. He previously served as the chief economist at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and as an associate director at the White House Office of Management and Budget during President-elect Trump's first presidential term. His insights on fiscal responsibility and economic growth are invaluable, and he contributes to a plethora of think tanks and other organizations around the country. Good morning, Vance.
Hey, Jeremy, I'm doing well. It's good to be with you today.
Together, we're excited to dive into today's discussion. We'll be sharing our thoughts and insights on some of the major policy issues we think will be brought up in the 89th legislative session, which starts tomorrow at noon, and perhaps most importantly, hearing from listeners like you. Some brief housekeeping before we dive into today's discussion. I'd like to take a moment to share a little bit more about Texas Policy Research and how you can stay connected to our work. At Texas Policy Research, our mission is to ensure that Texas remains a beacon of freedom and opportunity by providing dependable legislative analysis, data-driven research, and actionable insights. We focus on promoting limited government, free markets, and the principles that make Texas exceptional. If you're interested in staying informed and getting ahead of the curve on legislative updates, we encourage you to subscribe to our legislative digest. These are the sort of first pass, if you will, on legislation already filed ahead of the legislative session. We've read over 2,500 bills already, and we've provided the brief digests or summaries for free to anyone that's interested. You can access them again for free at texaspolicyresearch.com/legislative-digests. Now, as we shift gears here, let's dive into some of the major policy issues that we anticipate during the upcoming 89th legislative session. These topics are crucial to the future of Texas and align closely with our mission to promote limited government, free markets, and personal liberty. Now, I want to emphasize that what we'll discuss today is by no means an exhaustive list. The Texas legislature touches on countless issues each legislative session, and it's simply impossible to cover every topic under the sun. However, we've identified a few key areas that are likely to dominate discussions and debates in the months ahead. From the outset, I want to make sure it's clear that the information we intend to discuss today is meant to be informational and objective. We certainly have a prism that both of us look at these issues through, grounded in what we call our liberty principles, things like how these policies affect the issues of limited government, free enterprise, and personal responsibility, etc. But today's discussion is intended to provide information as objectively as possible. So with that in mind, let's explore what's on the horizon. We would be remiss if we didn't say at the top of the list, certainly, is school choice or parental empowerment. It was the largest issue, I think, and arguably the largest issue brought up in both the primary election cycle and general election cycle, something made a big issue by Texas Governor Greg Abbott himself. Vance, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Jeremy, no, I think school choice will certainly be something that's going to be discussed a lot, as it was 2 years ago in 2023. A lot of bills.
Uh-oh, did I lose you?
On legislators' minds and the public mind for... I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can.
Hello?
Okay,
Hello?
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead and start this section over. You're good.
Okay. All right. Yeah, school choice will certainly be a big part of the discussion here in 2025, as it was in 2023 when there were two special sessions on school choice. And then we heard about it in 2024 with the primaries. That was a big part of the discussion and debate about what happened there. And then even in November during the general election. So there's a lot of discussion going into school choice. It's something that Texas has fallen behind in other states. There are 12 states that have some form of universal education savings accounts, and there are more than 30 states that have school choice. Texas doesn't have any. And so I think we're going to hear a lot about funding issues with public schools, some called government schools, but the funding issues there, whether they're overfunded or underfunded, and different debates, and then what the influence that will be from school choice. I'm hopeful that it'll be as universal, meaning that every parent who wants their kids eligible can apply and get the funds to allow for them to send their kids to, that's going to meet the unique needs of each one of their kids, I'm hopeful that will really be the case. We've even heard Lieutenant Governor Patrick talk about school choice here recently. And so I think this is going to be a hot topic here in this legislative session. And of course, Jeremy, the speaker race, which will be determined tomorrow on the first day, I mean, that's going to have another big influence on what happens with school choice. So a lot of key issues happening around this particular issue.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how this issue develops. You know, historically, the topic of school choice, granted it's had kind of different variations legislatively over the last few years, has met its legislative demise in the Texas House of Representatives. And so given the kind of contentious primary election cycle, general election cycle, and then depending on what the results are of tomorrow's speaker vote, if you will, by lawmakers on the floor, I think you're correct in that we'll see some version. I think the question is, what does it look like going into the legislative session? Let's pivot towards another, kind of big topic. It seems like a big topic in every legislative session, at least in the last decade or so, and that's property taxes. Now, obviously, there is every cycle. There's a litany of bills that have been filed to address the growing burden of property taxes. Recently, the comptroller revised his numbers, showing that despite past relief efforts, it seems like the overall tax burden did, in fact, increase on Texas taxpayers. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, property taxes are a key one. Another one, just like with school choice, property taxes is another key part of the debate that's going on for years now here in Texas, as Texas has one of the top 10 most burdensome property tax systems in the entire country. And there's also a big push, of course, for people to own their own home instead of renting from the government, is to own their own home. So you have this discussion about how much should local governments be spending and how much should property taxes be going up? And then you have this other part of the discussion saying, well, should property taxes even exist? And so I think with all of this discussion, we've seen bills that have been filed that it would eliminate property taxes over maybe a couple of years or even 5 years. There's also the buy down, like the surplus buy down approach, where if you limit state spending, you could buy down the school maintenance and operation property tax, which I've done a lot of research in that space for a number of years. And there are several bills that are filed to do that. I think that'll be another big part of the discussion. And today, we are also going to hear from Texas Comptroller Glenn Hager on the biennial revenue estimate that will indicate to the legislature how much revenue that they will have available to spend to put towards property tax relief and other efforts, and also what the surplus will be. Last session, the surplus was $33 billion. There was about $12.7 billion of new property tax relief last session, from the homestead exemption increase from $40,000 to $100,000, and a reduction of the school M&O property tax rate by 10.7 cents. That didn't turn out, unfortunately, to be a substantial property tax cut. In fact, the latest data, as you mentioned there, the Texas Comptroller showed that the property taxes from 22 to 23, which 2023 was the first year that we would have felt any of that relief from last session, property taxes across the state actually went up about $700 million, or a 0.8% increase year over year, even as they put all this money towards it. So, I think that's something we're really going to want to watch, because school property taxes did go down about $4.5 billion. However, cities, counties, and special purpose districts increased their property taxes by about $5.2 billion. And so that's that delta. We saw property taxes still go up by about $650 million year over year. And this ended up being the fourth, not the largest property tax relief in dollar terms, but in the fourth largest as a percent change of that 0.8%, because you have to go back to 2007 was the last time that property taxes actually went down. And then in 2010 and 2011, property taxes didn't increase as fast or as much as they did last year or in 2023. So I think, this is something that really needs to be looked at. And if the comptroller says what I think he will today, that there could be about $20 billion in surplus for the upcoming legislative budget period, then I'm hopeful that they'll use most, if not all of that, for more property tax relief to reduce property tax rates, because that is really where we're going to hear this. But of course, Jeremy, I mean, there's going to be a lot of demands for many other areas of the budget. And so that puts the question, okay, how can we actually rein in these property taxes? And I think we've got to look at local spending, looking at the local spending limits. There are already bills that would put local spending limits in place. Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, when they put it in place in their constitution in 1992, it not only imposed a state spending limit based on population growth plus inflation, but it also covered local spending. And I think that's something that Texas really should do, is to strengthen our state spending limit and include local government spending as well. And what's nice about the one in Colorado is that, Colorado's went from red, purple to blue, politically speaking. And what that's done is it's still what that constitutional amendment did for spending limit kept their spending in check. And so I think that's what we need to be doing here in Texas as well, is to look at that. And I'm glad to see so many bills have already been filed to do something along those lines, because reining in local spending will go a long way to reducing property taxes, putting them on a path to elimination, while also finding ways to reduce the burden of government across the state.
Well, certainly something we'll be paying close attention to in the upcoming session. As you said, there's tons of bills that kind of address this in different ways, and almost inevitably this will be something that lawmakers attempt to address again. So that way they have something they can continue to run on, obviously, as they run for re-election and what have you. Let's pivot towards infrastructure. Obviously, I think last I checked, there was a little over 1,100 people to the state, or that moved to the state from all walks of life, all across the country, from different countries. And so obviously that influx of individuals creates potential infrastructure challenges. Lawmakers do try to address infrastructure in some capacity every legislative session, but almost certainly this will be something that comes up in a slightly different way this legislative session. These are things like water projects, flooding, roads, transportation. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, Jeremy, and one thing I should just add a caveat in there is you said 1,100 people moving to Texas, and that's every day on average. Every day on average, we have 1,100 people. So this is a ton of new people, and it does put more and more demand on our infrastructure, whether that be, like you said, on the grid and energy in general, or on water, or on the roads. I mean, all this is very important, of course, for a free and prosperous state. But there are trade-offs. As Thomas Sowell said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And that's another thing that comes in with infrastructure. Last session, the legislature passed a constitutional amendment that created what's called the Texas Energy Fund, which they put in $5 billion. Voters approved it, so now that's in the Constitution. It also moves it outside of our constitutional spending limit, because anything that's constitutionally dedicated is outside of the spending limit, which gives them free reign to spend even more on that if they so choose. But of course, that puts demand on or crowds out other areas of the budget. Kind of like going back to no solutions, only trade-offs. And when you have other demands on education, healthcare, water, it starts to dry up these taxpayer resources really quickly. And so we're already seeing a move to expanding the Texas Energy Fund in particular, which basically provides low interest loans, almost grants in some sense, to dispatchable power generation, in particular, a lot of natural gas projects. And there was a lot of demand for it, and we'll see what happens this time around. But even Lieutenant Governor and the governor have advocated for adding another $5 billion this session to that program, to that fund. And so that's going to be something we'll want to watch. There was also the creation of the Texas Water Fund, which provides access to funds across the state to build more water and pipelines and things of that nature. And so, while that is a growing demand and a growing need, and of course there's a shortage there, is putting more money from the state the best avenue to go down. And I hope that there is a good discussion among legislators about that, because there's also a good argument that we need prices of water. We need a market, a free market, if you will, that allows for water to be better allocated across the state. And maybe desalination. We have a huge Gulf of Mexico. I mean, there's a lot of water all around us. How can we better use that water? And is spending I don't know, $50 billion over the next how many ever years for water really the best way to taxpayer dollars? I'm not so sure. And so that's something that they really need to look at. And then also, roads, right? And highways and everything else. There already is a state highway fund that's constitutionally dedicated. Part of the sales taxes goes into that. The severance taxes from oil and gas activity that fund our rainy day fund, which is supposed to be about $24 billion. Half of the severance taxes goes in the transportation fund. And so that's already constitutionally dedicated. So we've got a lot of money floating around, Jeremy, between these different types of infrastructure. And oh, by the way, there is also what's called BEAD funding for broadband across the state. And a lot of this money has also been contributed to by the Biden administration from federal funds over the last few years. And, that's created a situation where some people are thinking this is quote unquote free money, but no matter if it comes from the federal government, the local government, the state government, it's coming out of our pockets as taxpayers. And this is something we've really got to look at closely and decide, is this the best role for government to be leading the way, or should the private sector be leading the way? I think you probably know where I'm at on this. I'd rather the private sector to lead the way. But this is certainly going to be a big topic of discussion this session.
Well, this topic certainly bleeds into just kind of another general topic, which inevitably is always a big issue every legislative session, and that's the budget or state spending. Obviously, you touched on some of this a little bit, but why don't you give kind of an overview of where the last biennial budget was, maybe compared to previous budgets, and then what we're potentially looking at, depending on what the comptroller says today with the BRE and everything going forward.
Yeah, Jeremy, the budget is something I've been following for more than a decade now. And the last budget was $321 billion for a 2-year budget cycle of 24-25. So if you divide that by 2, it's about $160 billion a year is what they're spending between state funds, your sales taxes, franchise tax, and other things, and then federal funds of how much money. And the total state budget, $321 billion, about a third of that comes from federal funds. And so that's mainly for Medicaid. Some of it's for education, some for transportation, but it's dominated by Medicaid spending. And so that's where you start getting into, okay, how much did the budget grow by? The budget grew from appropriations to appropriations, which is the apples to apples comparison that we have available right now, by 32% just in state funds. And if you include federal funds, it grew by about 21%. Regardless, it was more than a 20% increase in the budget, which is more like something progressive California would do, not in Texas. And from what I can tell, going back as far as the records have, this is the largest budget increase in Texas history. And so I'm hopeful that the starting point this session will be to freeze the Texas budget or not grow it at all. If not, cut the budget. I mean, if we grew by that much, surely there's got to be some areas of waste, fraud, and abuse, or just areas that should be cut, and start thinking about bringing down the size and scope of government, because how much of our government spends is really the true burden of government on its people, on the taxpayer. And so I think this is something that's going to be fresh on people's minds. Of course, there's going to be discussion about what to do with healthcare. Hopefully, there will not be a Medicaid expansion. That always ends up coming up in some capacity. That's Article 2 is the healthcare part of it. And then Article 3 is education. On the state side, when you think about general funds, the area where the legislators have the most discretion over, it's dominated by education spending. But when you look at the total budget, with including federal funds and everything else, healthcare is right up there along with it. They almost cycle through either Article 2 or Article 3 being the largest each session. And so that's something we'll really want to watch, because that drives the overall budget as a whole. And it goes back to our discussion earlier, Jeremy, about school choice. Are they going to double up on funding a lot more for public schools while also funding an ESA program? Or could there be a path to moving to an ESA program entirely? These are the types of discussions that I think we need to have, because if not, this budget is just going to continue to explode, and we need to find proper checks and balances in place, which I think would start with having a stricter spending limit on the state as well. But yeah, the budget's going to be a main topic. And Jeremy, as you know, I mean, the only thing that the legislator has to do every session is pass a budget. And it's going to hear a lot of discussion back and forth between the Senate and the House. But at the end of the day, I hope that they can understand that this is really the people's money, taxpayers' money, and they need to be wiser use compared to where we have been, at least in the last session.
Fair enough. I mean, I certainly agree that it's concerning that we have the largest spending increase in Texas history while simultaneously having a historic budget surplus, representing an overcollection of taxpayer dollars. Let's pivot here. We'll kind of rapid fire these next few sections, if you will. So one of the policies I don't think that has come up, certainly hadn't come up in the capacity we expect it to come up in this legislative session, is the regulation of artificial intelligence. Obviously, there's a few bills that have already been filed to kind of address this in different ways, but it seems like the large one, or the big bill, if you will, is House Bill 1709, authored by State Representative Giovanni Capriglione, a Republican from Southlake. Of course, he was the chairman of the House Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technologies. You were a signatory on a coalition letter that expressed some concern over what the draft version of the bill, specifically because it's calling to regulate AI in certain ways. What are your thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, I certainly know Representative Capriglione is. I think his heart's in the right spot, and there's good intentions here. But my concern is, as you said, there's a lot of regulations on the AI, the technology itself, instead of the output. And while I think that a lot of the output from those regulations, like discrimination and other things, are already under current law. There doesn't necessarily need to be new laws, just follow the laws that are on the books. And so these sort of new regulations, I think, would stifle innovation in AI, and especially as the technology sector continues to be a bigger part of our economy in Texas. This is a huge concern that I and many others have. And instead of following, which much of this bill comes from a blue bill out of Connecticut, Colorado, and California, I think we should start looking more at bills like in Utah, or even the ALEC model legislation, American Legislative Exchange Council, as a more of a conservative viewpoint, a limited government sort of perspective. But regardless, Jeremy, look, this is one of those issues that I think people fear a lot. And so sometimes when fear comes into play, you oftentimes want to overregulate it to kind of stifle that fear, instead of looking at some of the other problems that may come with that regulation itself. And so I'm hopeful that cooler heads can prevail on this issue, but it's certainly one that's going to get a lot of debate.
Another topic that almost certainly will come up, and again, in some capacity, at least certainly in the Texas Senate, we'll see about the Texas House, is that of taxpayer-funded lobbying, or specifically trying to prohibit or ban such a practice. Obviously, the history on this is that it's kind of passed in a variation of ways, again, from the Texas Senate, and has died or met its legislative demise in the Texas House of Representatives. What are your thoughts on the prospects of banning such practice this cycle?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that this is the cycle that happens. Taxpayer-funded lobbying is a big issue. It's one of the reasons why I think that local governments are able to spend more and more without having the proper checks and balances in place. And it's essentially become where government officials in some capacity are being funded by taxpayer dollars to expand government. So our dollars are being used against us in that capacity. And I think if you took an approach that said, okay, well, the best of intentions are there, they're trying to do the best that they can. Well, a better way to do that is, instead of getting lobbyists and everything else, is to actually, go and talk to their members, the local officials and everything else. I think that would be a better approach. That would be the more republic that we're in today, compared to paying lobbyists to then go and demand larger government in the process. So hopefully this is the year that will happen.
Well, let's hope so. Speaking of kind of local government, there's been this recent phenomena around the country, but certainly we've seen this most recently, I believe, in Harris County, in Houston, the idea of a guaranteed income program. We saw some litigation, if you will, from the Texas Attorney General's office to try to stop this program. I think multiple attempts now have been tried by Harris County to implement such a program using, federal funds, i.e. taxpayer money, on the federal end to basically pay people what they call, quote unquote, a living wage, end quote, for doing nearly nothing, it seems. What are your thoughts on that? There is some legislation already filed in both the House and Senate. Once again, on the Senate side, there's a bill by State Senator Mays Middleton, Senate Bill 395, and then the companion on the House side is House Bill 530 by Ellen Troxclair, both Republicans, that have filed a bill to kind of prohibit or preempt, if you will, the idea of guaranteed income programs being implemented on the local level. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think this is another one that needs to be looked at. I mean, last session they passed what they call the Death Star bill, and so this was a step in this direction. And I think what they're finding now is that there's some other ones that there's some other regulations at the local level that weren't covered that should be. And so I think we're going to get another stab at that. And I think this is another area that allows for more of a pro-growth atmosphere. If you have a consistent regulatory regime across the state, that looks much better. I'd like for it to be even lower at the end of the day, but it looks much better than if you have to worry about each regulation depending on where you are across the state. That raises the cost of doing business and everything else, and ultimately hurts the consumer. So I think this is hopefully a good step in the right direction that will also see good debate on the floor.
All right. And finally, the last topic policy area that we think will be covered here. Let's talk about the proposed social media ban for minors, right? So obviously, we've got, I think it kind of centers around the question of who should protect children online, right? Should it be the parents or the government? There was the recent discussion, I guess, ongoing discussion on the federal level between what's called COSA, or the acronym of COSA, versus, here in Texas, we have a filed bill by State Representative Jared Patterson, a Republican from Frisco, House Bill 186, that ultimately aims to preclude individuals 18 years or younger from being able to create a social media account or be on a social media platform. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, this is another one that's a hot topic, as you mentioned, across the country and including here in Texas. And there was some push to do a little bit of this last session, didn't quite make it through. And so there's another push this time around. I think you hit on the key question here is who decides? Who decides what's going to be best for parents? And I'm hopeful that the legislature will discuss this and really think about that question. My view personally is that I think we should let parents decide over politicians and bureaucrats about what happens with their kids and being online. There's also a lot of positive things, just even though there's most of the negative things online are often discussed on social media. And, being a social media, they don't like it, but that's where they're discussing a lot of this. and so I think that this is something that I'm hopeful that we can let parents decide what's going to be best for kids, and that's their kids and not politicians and bureaucrats.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to take a moment to remind you of the valuable resources that Texas Policy Research provides to help you stay informed and engaged with the legislative process. Our floor reports are a key resource, offering in-depth, principle-driven analysis of legislation that's making its way through the Texas legislature. You can find more details about them at our website, texaspolicyresearch.com. We will begin publishing our floor reports as soon as bills make their way onto calendars in both the Texas House of Representatives and Texas Senate. Historically, that has been right around the bill filing deadline, which this session is March 14th, 2025. In addition, we offer a variety of tools and updates to keep you informed, including Texas legislative updates that track key developments in the Texas legislature, legislative spotlights, which are things like major policy issues making their way through the process, explainers that break down complex policies, data and research projects that present actionable insights, and our elected officials directory, which makes it easy to connect with your lawmakers. All these resources are designed to equip you with the information you need to understand, engage, and influence the legislative process. Be sure to explore these tools again at our website, texaspolicyresearch.com. We're committed to providing you with the tools that make a real difference. If you have questions or need guidance on where to start, do not hesitate to reach out. Well, that will do it for our 89th legislative session preview. We appreciate everyone joining us today. Certainly, if you have any questions, please reach out via our website, texaspolicyresearch.com, or on any of our social media channels. Thanks for joining us.